Welcome everyone. This is our science deep dive. And we are happy to have everyone here in order to share what's the science team doing, what has been the primary focus in the last months. So I'm Giselle Bowman, I'm the lead scientist, and Sam Bennett and Sophia Laker are here and going to be presenting with me from the science team at Regen Network. So first of all, I'd like to share the science team direction and kind of show what's the main objective for the next 3 years at least. So we are aiming to magnetize a community of scientists in a way that unlocks creative energy in order to use the Regen network in service to planetary regeneration. So the main intention here is to help people to make a shift towards regenerative practices and finding the right paths for education and culture, aiding in project and method development, building ecological assets, digital monitoring, reporting and verification support, and creating tools for scientific discovery. So in order to create all this knowledge and tools, we have our principal, I would say our main principles or core values, which are scientific integrity, independency. So we think of the science team always as an independent group from the business model itself. We aim to have everything open source and transparent. We ensure everything is aiming to protect the equity of all our stakeholders. We focus all our work in innovation. So innovation, also creating tools for inspiration, education, and increasing the culture around regenerative practices and implementation. And also one of the core principles is collaboration with other scientific groups and also with other organizations.
Cool. So yeah, I think that a lot of this presentation was just to kind of clue people in on what we're doing. When Sophie and I first got hired on a year ago, the three of us worked a lot on the impact ag projects and kind of developing our own methodology and running through the process of like creating an ecological asset. And it was a great experience, but over the last few months, we've kind of shifted away from our own internal methodology development and started to think more broadly about what is the science team going to do? Who are we going to support? And so in kind of thinking through that conversation, we were like, okay, like what is the main goal here? Which for us is turning ecological services and nature-based solutions into ecological assets. And that's a pretty complex process because at a high level, it's just like the science tracking ecological change, but that needs to be translated into methodology, it needs to be communicated to land stewards. People have to adopt the practice, and then we have to go monitor it and then ultimately store it on the ledger. And because it's such a complex process, we're going to shift away from developing this stuff internally and more supporting various communities. So the science team is going to be focusing on supporting project developers and land stewards on educating on what these practices are and how they can make the shift. We're going to be working with scientists that are creating digital MRV tools and doing research to support the science around these regenerative practices. We're going to be working with methodology developers and credit designers in creating methodologies that translate that science into kind of guides that can create ecological assets. And we're going to be working with monitors and verifiers to kind of create a digital MRV process, which makes it easy to track the change. And in terms of the processes we support, yeah, so we're really focused on kind of looking at methodology development, the scientific R&D, the digital MRV, and kind of just like making that process easier, peer review and curation. So figuring out, like which methods are more scientifically rigorous than others, which are more accessible to land stewards, kind of letting the commons decide of, which methods they want to use. Registry ledger integration. So figuring out like, how do we get all this scientific data and information onto the ledger? And then finally, science communication, which is really important because there's a kind of a gap between the work that's being done on the ground and the science behind it. And we want to make it easy for everyone to understand what's happening.
So I'm going to explain a little bit some of the tools that we are creating for internal and user experience of our platform in order to support the land stewards and the project developers mainly. So we are creating, for instance, some carbon class credits for grazing systems tools. The potential sequestration rates calculator and the sample size calculator are two of the main under current development. The intention from the potential sequestration rates calculator is that it will also be able to be replicated for other credit types for future development. So I'm going to explain a little bit more what all these tools are about. And next, yeah, so one question that we need to answer is what's the potential sequestration rate from projects under improved grazing management? Multiple stakeholders need an answer to this question before they enter a credit, for instance, a program, or before they want to sell credits, because they need to make informed decisions around that. Also, for internal use, our registry needs to know what's the potential of a project in order to get rewards from carbon credits all around the world. So we created this potential sequestration rates calculator, which is under current development. It's based on a wide scientific literature research and statistical analysis that are based on GIS and also on all the information that we gather from the literature research. The intention is that based on what we found are the sequestration rates from all the grazing systems that we could gather all around the world, we could create some model that can explain based on proxies or explanatory variables. This model could show what are the potential sequestration rates. So next, Sophie. So let's imagine this is an example, but this is the way we are. This is close to what we are creating. You could have information from the project based on the geolocation related to the soil type of the project, the main climate class, the management practices. This could be something that it's provided by the project developer, and some sort of information around silt content of the soils or topographic information that we can also gather from GIS. So once we have all this information based on the reported information from the project developer and from the GIS based on the geolocation of the project, we can, next Sophie, we can show what's the potential conservative estimation of the soil organic carbon sequestration rate for that area. So this is better than having what we had, which was only a global average of potential sequestration rates from grazing management, which is what's currently available out there. Then another question we needed to answer is what's the appropriate number of samples for projects using our carbon plus grasslands methodology? Because it's a nascent technology, it's a new methodology that we developed that is based in remote sensing, GIS, and also in sampling. We created this sample size calculator, which is something new. Now we can estimate, we created a model based on a lot of literature research where we linked the sample sizes that were provided for different levels of accuracy for projects with high, medium, and low variability in the soil organic carbon. And so now we created this tool, which is simple to use, where we can simply put as an input the grassland size of the project. And by a minimum knowledge of what's the potential diversity of the soil organic carbon within the property, based on some questions that we ask to the project developers, then we can estimate the minimum sample size and the optimal sample size. Optimal sample size means there's a higher accuracy and a lower chance that there will be any discounts based on uncertainty. And minimum sample size, it's what the science team considers is the minimum amount of samples that ensures at least a 50% accuracy, which is the lowest answered accuracy that our methodology allows.
Wonderful. So now that Giselle's kind of touched on how we're supporting land stewards, I'm going to pivot a little bit to one of the other communities that Sam highlighted at the beginning, which is how we're supporting methodology designers. So kind of there's many components of this. There's many needs here. Like Sam mentioned at the beginning, really the root of it is how to translate ecosystem services into ecosystem assets. And as everyone knows, you know, we have our current carbon plus grassland methodology, but really the bigger picture and the bigger goal is to expand out to other ecosystem services, say water quality or tracking for above ground biomass, you know, biodiversity, all these other wonderful ecosystem services from a range of regenerative practices. So work with the registry team, Erica Marie and the whole registry dev team to develop some really great websites and web pages that'll kind of walk a user through this overall process. Some of the other questions we had to answer is, you know, how do we deal with an individual that comes to us with just an idea, right? So some people are coming to us with, you know, extensive background on GHG accounting principles, but others are coming to us with just an idea of a specific indicator that they see within their own local ecosystem. So, you know, how do we deal with that? Like, is there a concept note situation there? Another question we had to work to answer is, what does the review process look like? Where might requirements differ from methodology to methodology? And again, yeah, making sure this process works for a range of methodology developers and kind of meets everybody where they're at. So I won't dig too deep into the details here, but overall, we created a workflow that kind of walks one through the process of taking a method that's just in, say, the idea phase all the way out to becoming a methodology that's accepted on our registry. And I'll kind of highlight some of the process in the next couple of slides. But again, this is all website pages that are, you know, created, and soon people will be able to work through them. So kind of just at a high level, again, huge shout out to the whole registry dev team for putting this all together in website phase and kind of taking some of our murals and documents and putting it in a really great workflow. So, you know, starting at the beginning, checking if a methodology already exists, you know, if they have an idea about something already exists, maybe see if it can fit into that box. You know, generating an idea for a methodology, submitting a concept note. So a very high level concept note, which might just outline a potential indicator they want to monitor and a potential way they want to do it, even though they might not have all the details on, say, the field samples or the remote sensing method used. And then working through creating the methodology draft, submitting it for internal review, and then having it accepted as a beta form on our website. And that's related to some of the review process, which I'll get into in this next slide. So that's one of the kind of first pages we created to support this process and onboarding methodology designers and developers. And as I mentioned, kind of the second component of this is how does the review process work? What does it take to go through a review and have it listed on our website? So like I mentioned, it's going to start at an internal review, taking a couple weeks to, you know, at least check that all the GHG accounting principles are there, you know, everything is that kind of needs to fall into the methodology exists. And then the second part of it, and this is where there might be some differences depending on what type of method and what type of credit are being developed, is an external review process. And this is broken into two parts. They can be run at the same time. The first is opening up the methodology to a 30-day public comment period. Anyone that has, you know, feedback or questions or critiques or concerns can drop in all of this into, you know, a specific form. And the other component of that is to have a couple scientific advisors relevant to the methodology review it. So, you know, if it's a forestry project or forestry method, having someone that knows the background of forestry related methods review it. Finally, compiling all this information into a revision report, making upgrades, and kind of working through that process. So these are kind of two of the components we've worked through in helping getting methods onboarded.
Quick question.
Yeah.
Is it possible, is there a process yet for evolving from a flex methodology, which is more open, to an institutional methodology, sort of like transitioning from one to the other?
Yeah, I don't think we have that. We don't have that specific process outlined, say on paper or on, you know, this website, but we do have outlined what different components would need to change in order for it to like level up, might you say? Does that make sense? So like the different GHG accounting principles. Yeah. And we have kind of documentation around all that that still has to be developed out in more of the website form. Yeah.
Awesome. That sounds like a really interesting like opportunity for people to sort of move from one.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. And so there's a lot we can get into this specific process. And again, we're kind of developing out these web pages and yeah, more information on that. Kind of moving forward in a related frame is the question of how to support these methodology developers without having them create their own method from scratch. So it's a pretty high bar and pretty intimidating to state, oh, you need to develop a whole methodology. There's so many different components, you know, that scares a lot of people away. So something that Sam and I actually leaned in pretty heavily on is creating these framework methodologies. And we started at a high level, which we called our nature-based solutions framework methodology. And this is a universal framework, which just highlights the various components that need to be considered when developing a methodology for ecosystem service claims, you know, providing a general structure and kind of definitions for like, what does additionality mean? What does leakage mean? And what are the different components and approaches you can take? Kind of nested under that are specific framework methodologies for specific indicators. So we also have developed out more in draft form right now, but a soil organic carbon framework methodology that outlines the set of requirements needed for any, you know, soil organic carbon stock quantification claim. And this could be like ours for grazing, but it also could apply for someone developing a method for soil organic carbon in a cropping system for cover cropping, or even in a forestry system. So kind of the sub primary indicator framework methods to kind of support these methodology developers. Yeah, I'll transition it back to Sam and we're going to dive more into the credit side of things.
Cool. Yeah. So, you know, kind of in like with the idea of not having people start from scratch and, you know, reusing different methodologies and like building off of the work of others. A lot of what we kind of try to focus on is this build your own credit idea. So with every methodology comes a credit, and you know, the intent of the credit class, which is different from other registries, is to kind of democratize and invigorate, you know, the design of ecosystem service credits to allow for a more flexible and modular approach, which unites different measurement systems, i.e. methodologies, under a shared set of definitions and rules and requirements. And so what the credit class does is it separates out the methodology from the programmatic requirements of a credit to provide a more adaptable solution and allow individuals to design their own ecological assets that fit their specific set of needs. So in essence, what we're trying to do is like provide land stewards with more agency over the credit design process and allow for bottom-up rather than top-down solutions. So thinking back to kind of like our framework methodologies, you can go back one. Like our framework methodologies are kind of providing them with a template. So it's like, hey, like you are seeing a specific set of like, you know, things in your area. And rather than reinventing the process, like you can use other people's methodologies, or you could use one of our frameworks and design a solution that fits for you. And what the credit class does is it buckets all of these solutions into a single credit. So you could have your like grazing credits that encompass like 5 different methodologies, each of which have their own co-benefits. Similarly, you could have like, you know, biodiversity credits or reforestation credits. And rather than having like hundreds of instances of credit classes, we can kind of bucket these all into just a few. The next one. So over the last month or so, we've been working to kind of focus more in on the design of the credit class. And again, the credit class is a set of definitions, rules, and requirements that can be shared by multiple methodologies. So rather than every methodology having to have its own credit class, multiple methodologies can use the same ones. So how we did this is we kind of broke it down into 3 main lanes. And so just focusing in on that top lane, what the credit class is like, again, like it's the metadata for this credit. So every credit needs to have an ecosystem type, whether that's like grasslands or forestry. Every credit is going to have a nature-based solution. So whether you're doing like composting or apiculture or, you know, reforestation or rotational grazing, like there's going to be some sort of nature-based solution. And with that, there's going to be a primary indicator. So are you looking at soil organic carbon? Are you looking at biodiversity? Are you looking at water quality? Like what is your your scientific indicator to show that this practice is working? And similarly, there's going to be a crediting unit. So the classic one is tons of carbon, but it could be, you know, like hectares of regenerated land, or it could be, you know, tons of compost, you know, taken to a plant or something like that. And so the top line kind of just defines all of the elements that methodology would need to be satisfy to use that credit class. And what we do is we want to define those somewhere like in a PDF. So the credit class you see on our website is kind of just it's like educational. It's like, you know, if I want to use this credit class, here's the description of the credit class, and here's the description of all these different things. So I can read about like what the ecosystem type is, like what is a grasslands ecosystem and what's considered, you know, grasslands, or what is like a, you know, rotational grazing as a nature-based solution. Does my practice fall within that? And then finally, we thought about, you know, like what is this ultimately going to look like on the ledger? So this bottom row is kind of just like a more like data representation of what credit classes could potentially look like on the ledger. So you can go to the next one. Sweet. So just to hone in on a few more examples, you know, so like thinking through this a little bit more, like if we say additionality is like required in a credit class, like that's simply just a yes or no. Like, are you including additionality in this credit class? Like, are you including aggregate projects in this credit class? Yes or no? Within the PDF, we might, you know, explain like what is additionality, what's considered additionality, so people can know whether or not they're doing that. And then, you know, like on like a more kind of metadata representation, we could say for this credit class, additionality is yes, aggregate projects are allowed. Similarly, like land ownership type, you could have, you know, credits that are specifically designed for, you know, indigenous landscapes, or those that kind of encompass like public, private, you know, indigenous, the whole thing. And this is kind of just showing what that looks like. And then the methodology down below is where you actually describe like, how am I measuring additionality? How do I determine what aggregate what projects can be aggregated? Does it have to be, you know, based off of ecosystem type? Is it location based? Do they have to have similar like climatic and soil types? Things like that. You probably go to the next one.
Great. So now that Sam has given a little bit of a background on how we developed it, kind of the next step was figuring out some use cases. Let's throw some examples at it and see how this credit class design stands. So kind of zooming in, you can see on the left, these are a bunch of different approaches and different credits that could be aligned to say reforestation or cover cropping. We're going to zoom in really specifically on rotational grazing, especially in relation to our current credit that we have developed. So when you're thinking about a rotational grazing credit, again, kind of thinking about this in terms of buckets. So on the left, you have a bucket, which is a more of an institutional credit. So your ecosystem type is grasslands, you have a nature-based solution of rotational grazing, and the credit unit is in tons of carbon of CO2 equivalent sequestered. So this is kind of where, you know, our personal carbon plus methodology would fall. You know, you have GHG accounting principles such as leakage and verification required. Within this credit class, then you would have a list of approved methodologies. So as long as each methodology fits everything in those blue and orange squares, it can fall into the bucket of approved methodologies under this credit class. And again, one method could be, including in-field samples. Another might be more model-based. But again, as long as it checks all the boxes of what's in those orange squares, you're good to go. And kind of aligned with that is another bucket of approved co-benefits, which align with this specific credit class. So you could take, a land steward would come, kind of assess, what are the different approaches that could be used for this specific credit, and then pull out the approved co-benefits that work best for their specific use case. And then kind of to zoom out a little bit and move over to the right, this might be something more of a flex credit. So again, walking through the specific metadata, the ecosystem type is still grasslands. You're still doing a nature-based solution of rotational grazing. But in this case, the credit unit, instead of being tons of CO2 equivalent sequestered, it actually could be something more along the lines of number of hectares regenerated. So this might be more of a practice-based credit. Again, might be a little bit less rigorous in terms of scientific needs. You might not have to go out and collect soil samples and do the whole carbon calculation. But again, this might work for a lot of land stewards who might not want to have that, the super intensive requirements outlined by the institutional credit. In this practice credit, it also might have less GHG, like accounting requirements in terms of leakage or verification. And again, similar to the left, you would be able to look at this bucket and see the approved methods in there, and also kind of the approved co-benefits. So yeah, this is just one example. We're excited to kind of test this out with more edge cases and throw different examples at it and see how it stands. But that's the main developments for the credit class there. Moving forward to see this in action, one thing that we've been super excited with on the science team is we've actually had a lot of interest in people reaching out to us looking to develop methodologies. So for this slide and the next slide, Sam and I are just going to highlight some of the main players we've been working with. They're coming at us, again, with a range of experience. Some of them are coming at us with a full method developed and GHG accounting principles kind of already checked off. And others are more at the development stage. So the first is the Carbon Farming Foundation. They're based out of Australia. They're developing a credit based on native reforestation on cleared land. Their primary indicator would be above ground biomass in this situation. The second is GFS Consulting, and this is a really interesting group. They're developing a method based on certifications of organic farming and sustainable fishing, specifically for Italy. And their primary indicator, again, because it's both above ground and fishing for organic certification, is carbon sequestration either through the algae below or above ground biomass. And they're also looking to develop some co-benefits of animal welfare and ecosystem health. And the third is BioHab, and they're doing a mushroom-based credit where they're taking mushrooms and using that material that's then compacted into building materials to do offsets. And their primary indicator is the carbon that's stored or reused and stored in these bricks. And I'll pass it off to Sam to highlight some of these others.
Yeah, some other cool projects that we have. We're currently working with Terragenesis in an organization called Albo on some reforestation credits. That's happening in, I forget where in South America. It'll probably be on the next slide, but that one's really exciting. Albo is providing the above ground biomass method, and they have like a really innovative approach using machine learning and a bunch of kind of like ground truth measurements, similar to our grasslands methodology. The next one, which is really exciting, is this one, Alimenta, where down in Peru, they're taking chicken fertilizer from the biggest egg producer in Peru, and then they're turning that into soil amendments, which they're then putting into different like rows of trees to help increase the soil. And the co-benefit that they're choosing to do, which I think is really cool, is microbe biodiversity. So they're taking an approach to biodiversity where they're actually looking at soil samples and seeing the diversity of various microbes there, which is pretty cool. Finally, we have this group called Soil Key that Rebecca and Sarah were talking to for a while, and they're really excited about developing their own method, which is a combination of rotational grazing and field aeration. So twice a year, they go and aerate the fields, and then they use rotational grazing practices, and it's shown to increase soil carbon quite a bit and kind of like rebuild, soil structure and soil health. And it's actually the only project that has gone through the ERF for a soil credit. And the ERF is the government sponsored Australian standard. So pretty cool to be working with them. Here's just like a map of where these organizations are. Like we're working with people like in Italy and Israel and, Australia and Africa. So getting a pretty diverse set of individuals engaged with our platform.
Giselle, did you want to touch on building community? Great.
Yeah. So we are aiming to build a big community of organizations and academic groups that is intended. So this effort is intended to gain feedback and gain connections to methodology developers, project managers, top scientists in each field of expertise. We also gain in being updated of new developments, tools, and technology. So in that sense, we are collaborating with the Earthshot Labs, which is an open source community, public benefit technology company and sustainable asset manager. We are also working active with Climate Farmers. Is a purpose-driven movement for a future in which humans live in harmony with the planet we live on. They describe themselves as that. And they are based in Europe. And then there are some other active meetings with the open team that everyone is involved with. And the Regen 1 accelerator. So the goal of the accelerator is to identify the best principles and practices for one target region, in this case is Northern California, and to establish a shared market-driven strategy that helps regional food purchasers to support a locally based regenerative agricultural model. So they have been developing standards for iconography, and we are going to be participating in a more GIS related group, which also links with the project that I'm going to share next. So one of the scientific contributions that we think the science team is actively engaging with is the global land regeneration potential map. So I will just give a very broad explanation of this. Imagine this tool as an onion. So first you have all the layers that matter for the purpose of developing the sustainable regenerative management practices layer. So we want to know what are the potential regenerative management practices that could be applied in each piece of the world based on some constraints like climatic, topographic, or historical constraints. Next, based on that, we can link all the practices that could be applied to a certain point of the globe with all the outcomes that are linked to that practice. So, for instance, potential carbon sequestration, or the impact on biodiversity of applying that practice, or on the water quality, air quality, risk reduction of floods or droughts. So that's the next layer that we need to build. Then the next layer is around storytelling. So this is great for culture building and for informing farmers what are their opportunities. So first, a farmer would have information of what are the potential suitable practices they could implement. Next, they have all the outcomes linked to those practices, and then they could link to all the farmers that are doing similar practices within their region or in their area, so they can connect and learn. And then the final layer is the one that links all the farmers and project developers with the buyers of the credits and the credit opportunities and the policymakers that could be working on, for instance, tax reduction for a certain management practice that reduces the risk of drought or something. Let's imagine California, reduction of fire risk, and then they could incentivize farmers to do those practices. So it's a very complex, and when we are actively working with all the communities we mentioned before, in particular with the Earthshot, in order to create all the layers that need to be built for this global map. And another contribution, I already described it, is the sample size calculator. So I won't go deeper into this one, but this is an unprecedented tool. I want to share that for anyone willing to know what's the amount of samples that they would need in order to apply either our methodology or any interpolation, spatial interpolation of ground truth data, they could use this tool. So it's a broader contribution that just to our stakeholders. Yeah. So Sam, would you explain? Yeah.
Cool. Yeah, another example of a project that we're working on with the science community is a stratification tool. So one of the big questions when you're running a project and going out in the field to take samples on whether it's soil samples or doing forest inventories, so going out and measuring trees, is you need to figure out like where you're going to go. And you can go out and randomly do it, or you could do what's called kind of a random stratified approach, where you divide the landscape into areas that you think are going to be homogeneous, and then you kind of distribute your samples equally between those different zones. So kind of looking on the left, you can see there's like, 4 main zones, and each of those probably have a similar level of soil carbon, or, similar soil properties of some sort, based off of just like topography, hydrology, like soil variables, as well as like vegetation. And so this is a kind of a complex process. There's a lot of statistical analysis which goes into it, but it's really important. And a lot of different organizations are interested in building a stratification tool that's like open source and publicly available, because the only ones that exist right now are private and you have to pay for them. So we've been working with RSI, who was kind of leading this charge on building out a tool, as well as this group called Climate Farmers out in Germany, and some people associated with White Buffalo Land Trust, to build an open source stratification tool where land managers can come in and say, like, I want to take 50 soil samples. Where are the best locations to do that? And it provides a little bit more insight into kind of the scientific process and why we're deciding where they should go in the field. Probably go to the next one. Then another kind of example of how we're contributing to the overall science community is with the Earthshot soils team. So Earthshot is an organization focused on doing data science that helps enhance our scientific understanding of climate change as a means of guiding practice adoption for regenerative practices. They have 4 main teams, and one of those is focused on soils. So the soils team is kind of separated into 2 bits. You have the research group, which Giselle has been working with, focused on identifying like what are the best regenerative practices, how do they affect the soil, kind of building off her work with sequestration rates and identifying like what are the best practices most suitable for this area. That's like a really important piece of figuring out what practices people should be adopting. And then the other subgroup within the soils team is the data group, which I've been leading. And so that's focused on first modeling soil carbon loss, cross-referencing that with land use change, and then using that as a means to predict where there might be the most soil carbon potential. And this is building off of work that a lot of great organizations have been doing. What we're trying to do is just like kind of compile all of that in one location and mobilize this really big group of data science that Earthshot has collected.
Great. Science team has been busy, so I'm going to keep rolling forward with some scientific contributions. Another component which I have been leaning into kind of along with both the support of Giselle and Sam is the development and support of co-benefits. So kind of throwing it back to the methodology developers slide and how we're working to support them. The other component is how to develop co-benefits and what are some options for co-benefits. So again, supporting the development of co-benefits to be incorporated in the aligned methodologies and the credit class design, or also to be used for storytelling. So maybe the metrics aren't directly monitored, but can be used as a good component in the telling of the story of the credit and the method. So working on developing some options and indicators, which potentially can be used for various co-benefits, such as say water. You could there's many different metrics and indicators that can be used for improved water quality. You could be looking at contaminants or heavy metals in specific water quality tests, or you could be looking at transparency. So just listing out a lot of these different co-benefit examples for our methodology developers, and then the different options of the metrics that can be used, such as say biodiversity or soil health, and even expanding into some resources and options for social and cultural co-benefits. So just kind of another component and lane we've been running in. And then 3 more things I just wanted to highlight really briefly as we wrap up. We've done a lot of research on GHG accounting principles and methods on other registries. These are a couple of screenshots of just something, a time where we looked in a specific, say, American Carbon Registry method and what were the validation and verification components to that. It helps us better understand where the market is and how, the different approaches that we might be considering when we're developing out the verification procedures and different guidelines and standards around that. So one of the other components we've been working on, again, back to more sequestration rate research. This started with one of our interns, Frankie, who did a lot of great work digging really heavily into some papers, which she passed off Giselle, on all the different sequestration rates globally that can be found for grazing systems. And finally, another component is doing, prior to moving method development more externally rather than internally for forestry methods, did a pretty deep dive on forestry method review and data sets and the different GHG accounting protocols associated with each. So just kind of a highlight reel of some of the other things that we've been working on, say in the background or kind of earlier in the year. And with that, I'll pass it back off to kind of wrap us up.
Cool. So that was a lot. We've been working on a lot of things, and we actually didn't get to cover everything. There's a lot of other really great work going on that we'd be happy to share and answer questions on. But just to highlight like what we're going to be working on probably in the next month or so, with our grasslands method, we're going to be going into the peer review process to kind of get that kickstarted and get it out of beta form. We're going to be doing more work with the credit class and kind of helping refine our ideas and our design in working with some of our early adopters that we shared earlier. We're also working on the Fibershed project, and Ned's been doing some really great work using their data to start generating some monitoring reports, which is really exciting because until now things have been kind of slow moving. We were waiting on data to be able to actually do the science. And finally, we're going to be doing some community building. So within the next few weeks, we're going to be hosting an event called Ecosystem Jam, which is focused on going beyond carbon. So how different organizations or different groups have taken a more holistic approach to regenerative land management and aren't necessarily trying to go for carbon credits. So yeah, I think that with that we can end, and we have about 10 minutes left. So we'll open it up to any questions.
Yeah, before we open it for questions, I'd like to give a lot of claps to Sam and Sophia, who have done an extraordinary work all this time since they entered the team. Also, I'd like to thank everyone in our team, in the Regen network team, that day-to-day contributes and dedicates so many hours with us to make all this possible. So starting with Ron, Sarah B, Rebecca, Jim Pittman, Frankie Capetta, many people contributing for making all this possible, for sure. So thanks, everyone.